The wind off the Devon coast tastes of salt and judgment. A widow, bartered like cargo, steps onto the bleak yard of the saltworks, determined to vanish into labour and silence. But a storm gathers, and with it a taciturn duke, whose gaze catches what others ignore. A woman's unbroken worth, ledgers whisper of theft, lanterns on the cliffs blink like secrets. And at the heart of it all, an impossible choice begins to form, between duty owed to crown and harbour and a desire that refuses to be traded away. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from. And one more question. In period romances, what steals your heart most? The slow burn tension, the clash of classes, or the heroine who won't bow? Plymouth, on the Devon coast of England, in the year 1597. The sea was a constant presence there, its scent in the wind, its roar beneath the cliffs, its salt clinging to the air like sorrow itself. The winter fog hung low that morning, softening the outlines of roofs and ships until the world seemed carved from ash and silence. Naomi Trenwith stood at the edge of the quay as the cart that had brought her rattled away. She had not cried when they took her wedding band, nor when her late husband's kin signed her over to the Countess of Barren in exchange for a forgiveness of debts. She had not wept when the steward announced her new station among the salt workers, her name written in the same ledger as barrels and oxen. Her eyes, though rimmed with fatigue, remained dry. The sea had taken enough from her already. She would not give it her tears. The saltworks sprawled before her, a skeletal plain of brine pans, smoking furnaces, and blackened iron cauldrons that hissed and sighed as if alive. Men and women moved like shadows through the steam, their hands raw from lie and heat. Overseers barked orders, their voices cutting through the clamour of shovels and wind. Naomi's arrival stirred no curiosity. She was just another widow, another pair of hands. Yet as she took the coarse apron they handed her and tied it firmly around her waist, something unspoken tightened within her, a silent vow that she would not vanish here. The Countess of Barren arrived that afternoon, borne in a carriage gilded like a reliquary. She was tall, severe, her silver hair wound in braids beneath a jewelled hood. The smell of rose oil followed her like a banner. When her cold eyes swept over Naomi, there was no recognition of shared womanhood, only possession. "This one will do," she said to her steward. "She looks sturdy enough. Keep her from speaking to the men. If she falters, replace her." Naomi bowed her head, not in obedience but to hide the spark of defiance that flickered in her gaze. Her first task was to carry buckets of brine from the pans to the furnaces. The wind lashed her skirt against her legs, biting through the thin wool. The salt stung every scratch on her skin, but she worked steadily, her movements economical, precise. She had lived through worse than cold and cruelty. Her husband's debts, his gambling, his nights of silence and shame, these had already taught her endurance. Here, among the hiss of steam and the grinding of the sea, she would endure again. As dusk fell, she noticed a boy watching her from behind a stack of barrels. He could not have been more than 12, thin as driftwood, his hair the colour of sand bleached by years of sun. One leg dragged slightly as he walked. When she paused to rest, he limped forward with a bucket nearly half his size. "You're doing it wrong," he said softly, his accent rough but curious. "You're pouring it too quick. It'll slop and waste." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And you?" she asked. "Do you know better?" He nodded solemnly, then demonstrated, lifting the bucket just so, letting the brine flow in a steady ribbon. "See? Less spill. The overseer won't shout then." Naomi smiled faintly, the first trace of warmth she had felt in weeks. "What is your name, boy?" "Tommy Reed," he said. "I watch and remember. That's what I do." She learned that Tommy had no family left, only scars of punishment for being slow with his limp. He brought her water when her arms trembled, scraps of bread when the overseers looked away. In exchange, Naomi showed him how to knot rope properly, how to balance a load across both shoulders, how to keep count without a slate or quill. Their understanding grew without words, two souls surviving in a world that mistook silence for submission. At night, Naomi lay on her straw pallet in the workers' quarters, listening to the wind batter the shutters. Beyond the walls, the sea raged against the rocks as though angry at the very notion of confinement. She thought of her husband's kin, of their smooth faces as they signed her away like a piece of furniture, and she felt no grief, only a strange, clean stillness. The Countess might own her labour, but she would never own her mind. One evening, as the sun sank behind the harbour, Naomi stood alone by the edge of the brine pans. The water mirrored the sky, gold fading into violet. A cart creaked nearby, loaded with barrels marked for shipment. She frowned. The numbers carved into the staves did not match the tally she had heard earlier that day. She traced the markings with her fingertips, the salt biting into her skin. The discrepancy was small, but her instincts stirred. Someone was altering the counts, stealing from the supply. She said nothing, not yet. Secrets could be more valuable than wages if kept wisely. When the overseer's bell rang, Tommy came running toward her, breathless. "They're saying the Countess herself will visit again tomorrow," he whispered. "She's bringing the Duke from Redcliffe, the one who inspects the fleet. He's taller than a church door, they say." Naomi looked toward the sea, where the horizon burned crimson before fading to grey. A nobleman's visit meant scrutiny, power, perhaps danger. For a moment she imagined what kind of man would command ships and storms alike. And then she dismissed the thought. Men of that rank did not see women like her. She turned back to her work, steady and unhurried, her hands sure, her heart armoured. Yet as the first gull cried above the darkening bay, something inside her, a faint pulse of intuition, told her that her life, like the tide, was about to change its course. The wind howled in from the sea as if the very heavens were scouring the Devon coast clean of memory. It was a late afternoon, drenched in slate-coloured skies, with gulls blown sideways over the harbour and the brine pans steaming like cauldrons left too long on the flame. Rain fell in sheets, driving men to their hoods and women to their silence. The salt works, already a kingdom of hardship, turned near impossible under the storm's lash. But labour did not pause for weather, not in Penryn lands. Naomi Trenwith moved through the open yard with the sure-footedness of one who no longer questioned the cruelty of nature. She carried her weight evenly, her cloak already soaked through, the hem of her coarse wool kirtle clinging to her shins. Around her, the other workers fought to stabilize a brine pan whose frame had begun to sag under the weight of wind and water. The supports moaned like wounded beasts. If the pan cracked, it would flood the adjoining pits and undo 3 weeks of yield. "Ropes," she said, not loudly, but with enough force that the words carried. "And boards, brace the northern edge, the wind's turning." The men, uncertain at first, looked to the overseer, who was nowhere to be seen, and then obeyed. Naomi knelt in the mud, her fingers raw and trembling as she wrapped rough hemp around the base of the frame. Her eyes narrowed against the downpour, watching the water levels rise with every gust. Atop the hill beyond the saltworks, a black horse crested the ridge. Its rider cut a stark silhouette against the storm, the wind pushing back the edges of his cloak, revealing a dark leather jerkin and the gleam of a ducal crest on his shoulder. Duke Cassian Blackmore had arrived unannounced, accompanied only by a single aide and the weight of his rank. His presence stirred whispers in the harbour that morning, but few believed he would descend into the salt-fouled realm of the workers. Yet there he was, urging his mount forward, unmoved by the rain. His face was half-shadowed beneath the brim of his soaked riding hat, but his eyes, steel blue and unflinching, took in every detail with the calculation of a man used to navigating both battlefield and court. He dismounted near the main shed without ceremony, handed his reins to the steward without a word, and strode toward the brine pans just as a thunderclap split the sky. The wind tugged at his cloak, revealing the trim line of a sword belt and boots worn smooth at the edges. He walked like a man who did not care for spectacle, only for results. From a distance, he observed the commotion by the collapsing pan. His aide reached to speak, but Cassian raised a hand. His gaze had settled on the woman at the center of it all, the one with sleeves rolled to her elbows, soaked through to the skin, issuing quiet orders with the precision of a general. She did not shout, she did not plead, she acted, and others followed. She braced the beam with her shoulder until the younger men secured it. When it held, she stepped back, mud streaked up her arms, a curl of hair escaping her coif and clinging to her cheek. For the briefest moment, she looked up and met his eyes across the distance. Naomi felt the weight of his gaze before she saw him. He was not dressed as the lord she had known from a distance at market fairs or harvest festivals. He bore no jewels, no bright silks, no velvet doublets. He wore dark wool, damp with rain, and he looked at her not with pity or curiosity, but with recognition, as if her existence had registered in a mind that measured worth with quiet accuracy. She dropped her gaze first, more from instinct than submission. Men of such station did not linger in the storm to watch laborers at work, and yet he did not move. Cassian stepped forward slowly, his boots sinking into the churned earth. He passed the salt barrels without comment, noting the warped edges and uneven brands. He passed the workers, none of whom dared speak to him, until he stood a few feet from the woman he had watched tame a collapsing brine pan with nothing more than calm and resolve. "You," he said, his voice low but resonant, shaped by command. "What is your name?" Naomi straightened, brushing her hands on her apron, though it did little to clean them. She answered plainly, "Naomi Trenwith, Your Grace." The formality hung between them brittle as the wind. "You stopped a collapse," he said. "I did what was necessary." He tilted his head slightly. "Others would have waited for orders. You did not." "I do not wait to drown," she replied, her tone steady. There was a pause then, filled only by the rush of rainwater against the pan stones. Cassian studied her. Her eyes, not pretty in the way court women trained theirs to be, but fierce. Her jaw set with stubborn intelligence, her hair dark and soaked, but tied with precision beneath a work kerchief. She was neither young nor docile, and she was clearly not afraid to speak the truth, even to a duke. Naomi, for her part, had expected disdain or dismissal. She had prepared herself for his gaze to drift away, for his words to cut with noble condescension. But he did neither. He simply stood, watching, as if searching for the right measure of her. "I came to inspect the supply chain," he said at last. "There are discrepancies, delays, spoiled stores." "Then look to your ledgers," Naomi said, before caution could stop her. "And to the men who signed them." Cassian's mouth curved, not a smile. He was not the smiling kind, but something like acknowledgement. "Is that an accusation, Mistress Trenwith?" "A suggestion," she replied, her voice softer now. "From someone who carries the barrels, not tallies them." He gave a short nod. "Sometimes the lowest vantage sees what the highest cannot." The thunder cracked again, and Cassian turned slightly toward the direction of the harbour. "I'll be back," he said, almost to himself. Naomi offered no farewell, nor did he expect one. As he walked away, the workers began to stir again. The overseer returned, blustering excuses, but no one truly listened. Cassian's presence had shifted something invisible in the air, something that could not be named, only felt. Later that evening, as Naomi laid her cloak to dry near the low fire in the workers' shed, she caught her reflection in the rippled surface of a metal pail. Her face was flushed from rain and labor, a line of salt still crusted along her cheek. And yet, her expression bore the faint trace of something new, not hope, not yet, but a spark. The kind of spark born when someone powerful sees you and chooses not to look away. Cassian rode back to Redcliffe without speaking. His aide asked about the ledgers, the shipment counts, the meeting with the Countess, but Cassian only answered once, as they reached the crest of the final ridge. "There's a woman in the salt works," he said. "Find out how long she's been there." He did not explain why. And in the dim flicker of a chamber lamp that night, he unrolled the saltworks map again, not to trace supply lines, but to mark, quietly, where her name had been spoken. The morning sun over Plymouth was a pale deception, filtered through a veil of mist that refused to lift. It hung low across the saltworks, clinging to barrels, roof tiles, and shoulders, as if reluctant to leave the earth alone with its own bitterness. Naomi Trenwith rose before the first bell, her fingers already aching from the cold. There was nothing remarkable in the day's beginning, no storm, no noble arrival, only the quiet hiss of steam from the pans and the distant clatter of barrels being rolled down to the carts. Yet Naomi's eyes were sharper than most, and that morning they caught what others did not. She stood by the loading yard, ostensibly counting brine levels, but in truth watching a pattern emerge. 2 men loaded barrels onto the cart bound for Redcliffe's port. Naomi tilted her head, narrowed her gaze, and studied the markings. The numbers carved into the staves were wrong, too smooth, too shallow, and the sequence disrupted. She had seen these men work before. They did not always handle this shipment. She waited until they had gone, then moved quietly to the nearest cask. She wiped away the thin sheen of brine and traced the mark again. She remembered the barrels she had helped prepare 2 days earlier. These were not the same. The wood was drier, the bands older. Her breath caught. These barrels had not come from yesterday's harvest. They had been swapped. Naomi looked around. No one noticed. No one cared. The overseer was busy berating a worker over a broken hoop. The Countess had not made an appearance in days. She crouched low, and with a shard of charcoal from her apron pouch, marked the inside of the hoop discreetly. But it would fade with time, with handling and weather. She needed something more enduring, something the eye could not erase. That night, long after the salt sheds quieted, Naomi took one of the spare branding irons, the one used to mark defective casks, and altered its edge with a file. She worked by the glow of the hearth, her breath held steady. When she finished, the new mark was no more than the size of a coin, shaped like a curved line, bisected by a dot. She waited until dawn to burn it into the inside seam of a single barrel, deep enough to last, hidden beneath the pitch. She said nothing to anyone, and when the carts rolled toward Redcliffe once more, she watched her marked barrel go. It was an act of quiet rebellion, not against labour, which she had accepted, but against theft dressed in silence. In Redcliffe, the Duke stood on the dock, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. Cassian Blackmore had the gaze of a man who listened more to numbers than to words. His steward handed him the latest shipment log. Cassian read it, then motioned to the barrels. He tapped one with the toe of his boot. This one. The cooper pried it open at his command. Cassian examined the contents. He tasted the brine, then motioned for a blade. Carefully he scraped the inside of the seam. The steel tip struck something solid. Cassian frowned. With practiced hands, he peeled a sliver of pitch aside, and there it was. A brand. Small, precise, deliberate. He stared at it for a long while, unmoving. His aide began to speak, but Cassian silenced him with a glance. That afternoon, under the pretense of reviewing coastal production practices, Cassian ordered his horse and rode alone to the saltworks. No fanfare, no herald. The Countess had not been informed. When Naomi saw him approaching across the yard, her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen again. He rode straight to her, dismounted without flourish, and came to stand before her, his expression unreadable beneath the wide brim of his hat. "You marked a barrel," he said. Naomi stood still. The workers continued around them, but none dared come close. "I did," she replied. "Why?" "Because the ones being sent out were not the ones being filled," she said simply. "Someone is replacing them. The numbers don't match. I thought perhaps your grace might want to know." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I do." The silence between them held no discomfort, only gravity. Cassian turned slightly, surveying the yard. This operation is full of blind corners and echoing lies. I need someone who sees without being seen, someone who speaks only when it matters. Naomi felt the weight of his meaning and the danger behind it. "Are you offering me a position?" she asked. "I'm offering you a risk," he replied, "one that may be worth your intelligence, temporary, unofficial. You would advise my quartermasters when I am not here, quietly. No one will know except me." She considered him then, not as a duke but as a man. The scar at his temple had faded into a pale ridge. His eyes held no flirtation, no softness, only a kind of searching respect. "I'm not sure the Countess would approve," she said. "I am not sure I require her permission," he answered. Naomi gave the smallest nod. "Then I accept, but I work for truth, not for power." Cassian's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. "Then we are of one mind." He mounted his horse again and turned once more toward the harbour. Behind them, near the sheds, a figure had been watching, a servant in the Countess's livery. That evening, Naomi was summoned. The steward's knock was not a request. She followed him to the high stone house where the Countess conducted her affairs. The parlour was warm, perfumed, and lined with imported tapestries. The Countess of Penryn sat with her hands folded like claws resting on a velvet cushion. "I hear," she said coolly, "that you have drawn the Duke's interest." Naomi said nothing. "Do not imagine this to be a gift. His interest has limits. Yours should too." Still, Naomi did not speak. "I know the type," the Countess went on, her voice like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Plain, practical, determined, and foolish enough to believe they are safer than they are. Let me remind you, salt may preserve, but it also wounds." Naomi's voice, when it came, was low and even. "Then let us both be careful where we spill it." The Countess's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. Naomi walked back to the workers' quarters beneath a sky lit by pale stars. Her boots struck the stones with quiet defiance. The wind tugged at her cloak. In the corner of her room, Tommy stirred from his cot. "Are you all right?" he asked, blinking sleepily. Naomi looked at him and gave the faintest smile. "I think," she said softly, "I've begun to matter to the wrong people." And with that, she sat by the hearth, hands clasped around her knees, knowing that she had stepped beyond the borders of survival and into something far more dangerous. Respect. It was the kind of danger that did not break the body, but shifted the world beneath it, the kind that began with a name spoken by a man who listened. The days that followed drifted into a strange stillness, not for lack of labor, but because something in the rhythm of the salt works had shifted. It was not spoken aloud. There was no announcement, no decree. Yet the air around Naomi Trenwith felt subtly altered, as though a current she could not see had begun pulling her into deeper waters. Cassian Blackmore came often now, never with a full retinue, never under the Countess's banner. He arrived without warning and stayed longer than was required. His presence no longer startled the workers. They had learned to lower their eyes, to keep their mouths shut. But Naomi sensed their wariness. There were whispers in corners, glances too quickly averted. Still, no one questioned her when she walked beside him across the brine fields, carrying a shallow dish of salt crystals, or when she stood at the Duke's side during inspections that once required only stewards and scribes. They rarely spoke in full sentences. There was no need. He watched closely, she moved deliberately, and their shared silences were more eloquent than most men's flattery. One morning, before the light had fully broken, she waited near the shallow pans that had cooled overnight. Frost glittered along the edges of the stone, and the wind curled in soft, sharp gusts across the yard. Cassian approached from the far path, his cloak trailing behind him, eyes already narrowed against the wind. She handed him a wooden paddle with a thin layer of crystallized salt. "Too coarse," she said. "Too fast to boil yesterday." Cassian scraped the edge with his gloved thumb, bringing a bit to his mouth. He tasted, grimaced slightly. "Bitter." Naomi nodded. "Salt should bite. This one wounds." He examined the pan, running a hand along the outer stone. "Steam too hot." "Fire stoked with green wood," she said. "It leaves residue in the brine." He did not argue. He did not challenge. He simply turned to her and said, "Show me." That became their pattern. She showed him how to judge the weight of a barrel by the sound it made when struck. He taught her how the Navy encoded its shipping records to obscure surplus fraud. She traced salt blooms on wooden slats and read stories in the warping. He taught her how signatures could be forged but not handwriting pressure. They walked together in the late hours when the salt yard slept, when the furnaces died down and the sky was low and blue and silent. There was no laughter between them. This was not a courtship of play, but something gentler than joy and older than flirtation. Trust was growing between them, slow and careful as a vine curling around stone. One evening Naomi guided him toward the north shed, where the refined brine was being stored in long troughs before crystallization. She bent to test the water with a polished glass rod, watching the bubbles shift. "Touch it," she said, handing him the rod. "Let your wrist feel the weight of the water." Cassian obeyed, his brow furrowing with focus. "It's heavier than I expected." "Salt thickens the water," she murmured. "It carries memory in weight. The longer it's boiled, the more it remembers." He turned his gaze to her then, not in confusion, but with the stillness he always carried, one that made people nervous, except her. "Do you remember much, Mistress Trenwith?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "Enough." That word held pain, but also resilience. "And you?" she added, not turning away. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Enough," he echoed. They stood there, close but untouched, until Naomi turned back to the trough. Later, as they walked toward the lower yard, a sudden gust of wind tugged at Naomi's coif, pulling it loose. Strands of her dark hair whipped across her face. Without thinking, Cassian reached out to tuck a lock behind her ear. His fingers brushed her temple. Naomi drew in a sharp breath, not from the contact, but from what it revealed. Beneath his hairline, nearly hidden beneath the layers of time and weather, was a pale scar, long and fine, disappearing into his sideburn like an old whisper. Her hand rose before she could stop it. She touched it, just once. A light graze of her fingers across that pale ridge. Cassian flinched, but he did not move away. His eyes did not leave hers. They stood like that, connected by something that had no name and needed no permission. She did not ask how he got it. He did not offer. The silence between them deepened, not in distance, but in gravity. He lowered his hand, and she stepped back, her face composed once more. Nothing was said, but everything had shifted. That night, Naomi returned to the workers' quarters with hands that would not still. She sat by the dying fire, her palms pressed together, eyes on the coals. Tommy lay nearby, curled beneath a frayed blanket, his breathing steady and slow. He stirred once, murmured her name, and turned over. Naomi stood and crossed to the narrow window that overlooked the salt fields. The moon had risen, silver and cold, glinting off the water like scattered coins. In the distance, a figure moved, Cassian walking the perimeter alone. He did not look toward her window, and yet she felt that he knew she watched. She closed her eyes. There had been no promise between them, no overture of affection, but in the space between her fingertips and his scar, a vow had been spoken, one not of love, but of recognition. He had let her touch what most men concealed, and she, without words, had told him she would not wound him further. It was not romance, not yet. It was something rarer, respect born of silence. And in that silence, the first root of trust had taken hold. Not quickly, not with fire, but with salt. And salt, Naomi knew, could preserve more than flesh. It could preserve hope. The morning began like any other, grey, damp, and tasting faintly of the sea. The saltworks breathed its usual rhythm, the hiss of steam, the crunch of gravel beneath boots, the monotonous slap of brine against the pans. Naomi Trenwith moved through the yard with measured steps, her mind focused, her body worn but resolute. The Countess's shadow hung invisibly over every corner, and Naomi had learned to measure her words the way she measured salt, precisely, sparingly, and never more than was needed. A new overseer had arrived 2 days earlier, a man named Garrick. He was young, with a cruel mouth and hands too eager to strike. He served the Countess's will with untested zeal, seeing tyranny as proof of loyalty. Naomi had noticed the way his eyes followed her, not with desire, but with a kind of suspicion that grows when a man fears what he cannot understand. That morning, Tommy Reed worked nearby, his small frame bent beneath the weight of a shovel twice his size. Naomi had shown him how to balance the load, how to work smarter, not harder. "Shift the handle here," she had said the night before. "Use your body's rhythm, not just your arms. Let the earth help you." She had not known the boy would repeat those words aloud in front of Garrick. The blow came so fast that Naomi almost did not see it. A crack, then a cry, sharp and childlike, split the morning air. Tommy fell into the mud, clutching his ribs. Garrick loomed over him, a leather strap still raised in his hand. "Speak again, you insolent little rat," he snarled. "Think you can take orders from that woman instead of me?" Naomi froze for half a heartbeat, disbelief flooding her chest. Then something deep within her broke its silence. She stepped forward, mud splashing at her feet, and seized the man's wrist mid-swing. The force of the impact made her arm tremble, but she did not release him. "Enough," she said, her voice low and steady. Garrick turned, startled, his face twisting. "You forget your place." "I remember it too well," she said, her grip tightening. "You'll not beat a child in my sight." For a moment, there was only the hiss of the salt pans and the pounding of rain. Then Garrick shoved her back, his voice thick with fury. "You dare touch me?" Naomi's palm struck his face before the thought could even form. The sound echoed like the crack of a whip. A collective gasp swept through the workers. Garrick staggered, his cheek flaming red. The silence that followed was suffocating. Naomi knew what she had done, knew in that instant that her life as it was had ended. But she also knew she would not undo it. Garrick's expression hardened into something almost gleeful. "You've just sealed your fate," he hissed. By nightfall, 2 of the Countess's guards dragged Naomi to the manor. The corridors smelled of rose oil and wax. Her wrists were bound, though she did not resist. Inside the grand parlour, the Countess of Penryn waited, seated before a fire that crackled with expensive indifference. "So," the Countess said, her voice smooth as polished glass, "the Salt Widow raises her hand against my officer." Naomi's chin lifted slightly. "He beat a boy for following my example. If that is offence, then I am guilty." The Countess rose, moving toward her with the slow grace of a predator. Her gown shimmered in the firelight, deep red silk against her pale skin. "You forget to whom you speak. I own this land, this salt, and every life that works it. Your guilt was decided the moment you were bought." Naomi met her gaze, calm but unyielding. "You may own my labor," she said softly, "but not my soul." The Countess's eyes flashed with anger. "Your soul?" she echoed. "You speak of souls while you falsify the crown's measures? The Duke himself has complained of shortages. Do you think I do not see your little ledgers? Your clever marks?" Naomi blinked, momentarily struck silent. "My marks?" "Yes," the Countess said, stepping closer, her voice lowering to a hiss. "The Duke's attention has made you careless. He thinks you serve his interests. You serve mine." Before Naomi could answer, the Countess turned to the guards. "Take her to the holding room. She will face the tribunal tomorrow. Let them decide whether her hands are fit for labor or punishment." The guards seized her arms, pulling her away. Naomi did not fight. She kept her eyes fixed on the Countess until the doors shut between them. In the cold, windowless cell below the manor, the hours stretched like years. The walls were damp, the air thick with salt and despair. Naomi sat on the narrow bench, her back straight, her hands resting loosely on her knees. Fear gnawed at the edges of her composure, but anger burned brighter. Not for herself, but for Tommy, for every small, voiceless creature this world crushed for daring to exist. Above, the rain had stopped. The night was still when a soft thud echoed in the corridor. Then footsteps. The door opened, and Cassian Blackmore filled the threshold. His face was a shadow of its usual control, his jaw set like iron. "What have they done?" he demanded of the guard behind him. "She struck an officer, Your Grace," the man stammered, "and falsified measures according to the Countess." Cassian turned on him. "According to the Countess," he repeated coldly, "and you believed her?" The guard hesitated, uncertain. Cassian brushed past him and stopped in front of Naomi's cell. For the first time, Naomi saw fury in him, not the loud kind, but the kind that froze the air. "They said you were gone," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. "I came as soon as I received word," he said. His tone was low, but beneath it, emotion churned like an undertow. "They claim you tampered with Crown property." "I told the truth," she replied. "That was my crime." Cassian stepped closer, his fingers curling around the iron bars. The torchlight caught the faint scar at his temple, the one she had once touched. His eyes were sharper than she remembered, colder, but not toward her. "I warned them," he said. "If they move against you without trial, they'll answer to the Admiralty. Redcliffe's protection is not a courtesy, it is a necessity, and I will withdraw it." Naomi blinked, startled by the quiet ferocity in his words. "You would risk your position?" "I do not risk what is already mine to command," he said evenly. "I risk what is wrong to leave unchallenged." There was a silence then, fragile as breath. "Cassian," she began, her voice faltering on the unfamiliar intimacy of his name. "You cannot—" "I can," he interrupted, his tone softening but no less firm. "And I will." The guard shifted uneasily, pretending not to hear. Cassian turned to him. "Tell the Countess that if Naomi Trenwith is condemned without evidence, I will send word to London. Let her see how the Crown values her loyalty when her ledgers are examined." The man bowed and retreated quickly, leaving them alone. Naomi stood, the faint rustle of her skirt the only sound between them. "You should not have come," she whispered. "It will stain your name." Cassian's gaze lingered on her face. "Some stains," he said quietly, "wash away with salt water. Others are worth keeping." For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to narrow to the space between the bars, to the flicker of torchlight on his sleeve, to the rhythm of her breath matching his. When he finally turned to leave, his voice was low, but sure. "I will see you at the tribunal tomorrow. You are not alone in this, Naomi." After he left, Naomi sat once more on the cold bench, her pulse still racing. The fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the dread of being powerless, it was the fear of what power, when wielded by honor, might yet cost them both. Above her the manor's great bell tolled the hour of midnight, echoing over the brine fields and out to sea. Tommy, safe in the workers' quarters, stirred in his sleep, dreaming of light on water. And somewhere beyond the harbour, Cassian rode through the mist, his face set toward the coming dawn, his heart steadied by a single truth. The storm had only begun. The Hall of Justice in Plymouth was neither grand nor impartial. Built of local stone and stained by years of damp and sea air, it bore the air of a place that remembered old loyalties more than it revered law. That morning, its benches were filled with townspeople, salt workers, merchants, and men of modest title, all drawn not by justice, but by spectacle. The news had spread quickly. The salt widow Naomi Trenwith would stand accused before the tribunal. Outside, the wind stirred the banners that lined the square. Inside, the hall was hushed with anticipation, the silence brittle with judgment. Naomi stood alone at the center of the chamber. Her hands were unbound now, but the bruise at her wrist remained, a purple echo of the night before. Her face, though pale from sleeplessness, was composed. She wore no adornment, no lace at her collar, no veil to soften her features. She had chosen her plainest kirtle, the colour of ash and brine. It was not modesty, it was truth. The Countess of Penryn arrived late, as was her custom. She swept into the chamber like a storm wrapped in silk, flanked by 2 footmen and followed by her steward. Her gown was a deep crimson, the fabric shimmering with the sheen of power. She did not sit, not at first. She stood across from Naomi, her chin high, her expression unreadable. The tribunal was led by Magistrate Linton, an older man with careful hands and a voice that had long since lost the strength to inspire fear. He cleared his throat and motioned for the proceedings to begin. The Countess stepped forward. "This woman," she said, gesturing to Naomi with a gloved hand, "has endangered the Crown's supply chain through falsified measurements, tampered barrels, and subversive influence over the salt workers under my command." A murmur ran through the audience. "She has presumed above her station, challenged her superiors, and involved herself in matters far beyond her understanding. The result? Delays, shortages, disruption of naval provisions, at a time when loyalty to the Crown must be absolute." Naomi said nothing. She did not bow her head, nor did she glance toward the assembled crowd. She stood as she had always stood, quiet, steady, watching. The Countess signalled to her steward, who brought forth a stack of ledgers. "These," she announced, "are the official accounts. They show deliberate alterations in the tallies, recorded by this woman's hand. And here," she added, lifting a parchment, "a sworn testimony from Overseer Garrick, detailing her interference with shipments, her encouragement of insubordination, and her assault on his person." The steward unrolled the statement, placing it before the magistrate. Naomi did not move. Her breath was slow, each word from the Countess slicing through the air like frost over firewood. She knew the trap had been laid carefully. The Countess had not come unprepared. She had built her accusation with lies disguised as order. "Do you deny the charges?" the magistrate asked. Naomi lifted her eyes. "I deny their truth, but not their cleverness." A flicker of movement in the chamber drew her gaze. At the far end of the hall, the doors opened. Cassian Blackmore stepped inside. He was dressed in navy wool, his cloak damp from travel. He walked without hurry, yet every step resounded through the hall. His presence drew attention like a magnet draws iron. Even the Countess turned. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, rising halfway. Cassian inclined his head. "I request permission to speak." The Countess narrowed her eyes. "You are not the accused." "No," he said calmly, "but I am the recipient of the salt shipments this woman allegedly corrupted. And I have reason to believe the charges are false." Gasps rippled through the room. The magistrate looked at the Countess. "Objections," she smiled. "Let the Duke speak. I am not afraid of truth." Cassian strode to the front. He carried something wrapped in oilcloth. He set it on the table before the tribunal and unwrapped it, a single-barrel stave marked by salt and pitch. "I had this pulled from the most recent shipment received at Redcliffe," he said. "Inside the seam, beneath the pitch, is a second brand, one that does not match any official registry. It was burned by hand, hidden where no lazy thief would think to look." He handed the stave to the magistrate, who examined it closely. "This mark," Cassian continued, "was not made by accident. It was made by someone who suspected tampering and chose to prove it." The Countess's steward stepped forward. "Marks can be forged. The Duke himself admits it's not registered." Cassian turned. "And yet when I compared this to the last 6 shipments, I found that only barrels marked with this brand matched the actual quantities promised. The others were light, some nearly empty. The deception lies not with Mistress Trenwith, but with those who have replaced her honest work with false cargo." He looked to the magistrate. "Furthermore, I bring a witness. A figure rose from the crowd. It was an old fisherman, his coat frayed with age, his hands thick and weathered. "State your name," the magistrate ordered. "Elias Trent, sir," the man said. "I fish near the cliffs west of the Countess's estate. Past 3 months I seen lanterns flashing there on foggy nights. Patterns, not random, like signals. Same time the lighter carts go missing from the lower dock." The Countess's mouth tightened. "Hearsay. From a half-blind sailor." Elias met her gaze. "I may be old, my lady, but I know smugglers' lights when I see them. And I know when someone's using noble cover to do it." The room erupted, shouts, questions. The magistrate banged his gavel, demanding order. Naomi stood unmoving, her heart thudding, not from fear, but from the strange sensation of being defended, not by lies, not by power, but by truth spoken aloud in a place that had never given her voice. The Countess stepped forward, fury carefully masked. "This is a performance, a distraction. The Salt Widow may be clever, but cleverness does not equal innocence." Cassian turned to her. "Neither does cruelty equal truth." The tribunal recessed for deliberation. Naomi remained where she stood, her eyes fixed on the fire in the hearth. She did not look at Cassian, though she felt his presence beside her like warmth on skin, chilled too long. When the magistrate returned, silence fell again. "The tribunal finds insufficient evidence to convict Naomi Trenwith of falsifying shipments or disrupting Crown supplies," he said. "She is cleared of all charges." A collective breath was released. The magistrate turned to the Countess. "However," he added, "given the testimony presented and the evidence of irregular shipments, an investigation will be opened into the Penryn Estate's accounting practices. Until its conclusion, all coastal charters under Lady Penryn's authority are suspended." The Countess did not speak. Her face was a mask carved in porcelain, unbroken and unreadable. Naomi turned slowly, her body leaden with exhaustion. As she moved to leave the tribunal floor, Cassian stepped forward and extended his arm. She paused. The gesture was offered without pressure, without expectation. Her eyes met his, steady, unflinching, asking nothing, and yet she did not take his arm. Not yet. Instead, she nodded once, the smallest motion of acknowledgement, and walked beside him, not behind, not beneath, but beside. Outside, the air had cleared. The wind no longer tasted of judgment, but of something gentler. The townspeople parted to let her pass, some with bowed heads, others with quiet looks of awe. She did not weep, she did not smile, but she walked through them like a woman who had been forged in fire and cooled in brine. And Cassian, without speaking, walked with her into the afternoon light. The wind howled gently as it crossed the cliffs of Redcliffe, less with violence than with the ancient voice of the sea, calling home the weary. Naomi Trenwith sat at the edge of the bed, a real bed, not straw on stone, not burlap over slats, but a mattress firm with care and warmth. The fire in the hearth cast flickering light against the deep wood beams of the room, softening the edges of the unfamiliar comfort that now surrounded her. She had not undressed fully. Her cloak still hung from her shoulders, her shoes at the edge of the rug, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sleep had not yet come, nor would it, not while her mind still echoed with the weight of the tribunal, the fire in Cassian's eyes, the shifting silence in the room as she walked free. Redcliffe House rose on the headland like a sentinel above the sea, an old house built of dark stone and wide windows, its walls lined with maps and books, with heavy curtains to block the cold and silence that noble life so often demanded. But there was nothing cold in the room Cassian had given her. The fire had been lit before she arrived. A basin had been filled with warm water. A fresh gown of simple wool, no lace, no embroidery, just dignity and fabric, had been laid across the bed. She had not touched it, not yet. Her eyes drifted to the window. Beyond it, the sea stretched out in endless darkness, black as ink, but for the silver thread of moonlight dancing on its skin. The tide pulled back slowly, exposing the dark line of the rocks. Naomi watched it as though it might reveal the next turn of her life. A quiet knock stirred the room. She turned, startled, but did not rise. The door opened gently. Cassian stood on the threshold, his figure framed by the warm light of the hallway. He did not enter immediately. He waited. Naomi met his gaze. "I'm not accustomed to doors that knock," she said softly. "I thought you might need time," he replied, his voice hushed. "And silence." She nodded. "I've had enough of one. The other I'm still learning to accept." He stepped into the room. Not close, not imposing. Just far enough for the fire to catch the edge of his jaw, the familiar scar at his temple. He looked tired, but not worn, changed, but not uncertain. "I wanted to speak with you tonight," he said, "before decisions are made in the light." She watched him carefully. "Go on." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded parchment. He crossed to the writing desk, set it down gently, and turned back to her. "This is an official appointment," he said. "A legal position. Master of Stores for the Redcliffe Coastal Holdings. It comes with a salary, your own quarters, and full authority to inspect, approve, and redirect all shipments. Your name will be on every document, every seal." Naomi's breath caught. She had imagined freedom in many forms, escape, survival, silence, but never this. "You trust me with that?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "I trust your mind," he said, "your judgment, and your refusal to let anything go unseen." She rose slowly from the bed and crossed to the desk. Her fingers brushed the edge of the parchment, but did not unfold it. "I know what this means," she murmured. "I know what kind of power this holds, and I know what it could cost." Cassian nodded. "So do I." She turned to face him, her eyes sharp in the firelight. "What if taking this means losing myself again? Becoming what they once said I was meant to be? Owned, directed, bound to a man's name?" Cassian's gaze did not falter. He stepped closer, not to overwhelm, but to offer truth. "You've already built more than they could break," he said gently. "You are not standing in my shadow. You are standing in your own light." The words struck her deeper than she expected, not because they were grand, but because they were true. She unfolded the parchment. The ink was fresh. The seal of Redcliffe glistened faintly. Her name was written in the firm, even hand of someone who knew it mattered. She held the quill. She signed. Cassian did not smile. He only lowered his head once, in solemn recognition, as if the signing of her name was the final vow in a covenant he had not needed to speak aloud. He turned to go. At the door, he paused. "There's a boy in the stables," he said. "He refused to sleep until I promised I'd tell you he's safe." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. Relief washed over her, not with tears, but with a quiet release of breath. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and disappeared into the hallway. Naomi stood alone once more, the fire warm against her back. She looked at the signature. The letters were strong, the hand steady. It was hers. Later, she wandered barefoot through the quiet corridor and found her way to the back stairs. The house was silent now, the kind of silence that allowed a soul to breathe. She stepped outside into the cold night air, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. From the edge of the terrace, she could see the stables below. A small lantern burned near the open doors. Inside, through a crack, she saw Tommy curled on a pile of straw, a worn book open in his lap. He traced the letters with his finger, mouthing the words. A stable boy dozed near the wall. The boy had found light, and that light had found her. Naomi looked back toward the house, toward the room, the hearth, the parchment, the beginning. She was not rescued. She had risen. The sea, once a thing of threat and isolation, now sang below her like a lullaby. Its voice no longer summoned fear, but memory. She was still of the salt, still forged by hardship, but now she stood not to endure, but to lead. She returned to her chamber, closed the door behind her, and for the first time in years lay down in a bed that belonged to no one but herself. Sleep did not come quickly, but when it came, it did so without shadows. The wind carried the scent of smoke and seaweed across the Redcliffe harbour, rustling through crates and sails like an omen. The sky was dim, heavy with the weight of early dusk, and the tide crept in slow and deliberate as if it, too, sensed something amiss. Naomi Trenwith stood on the elevated bluff that overlooked the entire harbour, her eyes narrowing against the murky horizon. In her hand, she held a crumpled shipping manifest, ink smudged, signatures blurred, and half the crates listed without corresponding weight records. It was the third falsified document in less than a week. She turned slowly as Cassian approached from behind, his cloak billowing softly in the ocean breeze. His boots crunched against the gravel path, but he said nothing until he reached her side. "They're delaying our fleet," Naomi murmured. 2 full days past schedule. If the tides shift again, they'll miss the window to reach Exeter. Cassian exhaled deeply, his jaw set in grim understanding. Harbour permits being denied, warehouse locks replaced without notice, waitmen disappearing the moment they're questioned. None of this is coincidence. "No," Naomi said. "It's a message. One last blow from the Countess." She turned the page over, revealing a hand-drawn map of tide patterns and loading zones. Symbols she had penciled in herself marked drop points, lantern flashes observed by fishermen, and docking patterns that only a smuggler, or someone helping smugglers, would design so carefully. "She's still doing it," Naomi said softly. Anger caught beneath her calm. "She's trading stolen goods under the protection of noble freight, using bribes to stall your fleet while rerouting cargo through the cliffs at low tide." Cassian's face remained unreadable, but his eyes darkened. "The Crown has been patient, but if this reaches London before we prove it, they won't wait for truth," Naomi finished. "They'll act on rumour, and Redcliffe will burn with her." There was a silence then, thick with consequence. Naomi's gaze drifted to the sea again, calculating. The tide was turning. The hour was near. "We'll need bait," she said quietly, "and barrels that no one would dare ignore." By midnight, a small crew, handpicked by Naomi and trusted by Cassian, began preparing the decoy shipment. 10 barrels, sealed with the Redcliffe crest and falsely marked as gunpowder, were loaded onto an unguarded barge. Each barrel was filled with sand, salted oats, and parchment soaked in fish oil to mimic volatile goods. A single lantern would be hung from the barge's prow, flashing a pattern known only to the smugglers and the watchers on the cliffs. Naomi stood beside the dock, her hands calloused and swift as she affixed a hidden brand beneath one of the barrel lids, her mark, the same one she had burned into stolen casks before. This time, it would lead the thieves back to their master. Cassian watched her work in silence. There was something in his expression, respect, yes, but something else now, something deeper, not affection wrapped in softness, but admiration shaped by fire. When she straightened, he spoke. "You don't flinch from risk." Naomi met his gaze. "I flinch from silence, from letting things rot because no one dared lift the lid." The moon broke through the clouds then, casting silver over the dark waters. The barge slipped out into the current, carried slowly toward the bluff's shadow. Naomi turned her eyes to the cliff edge, to the faint pinpricks of light that had begun to blink, once, twice, then twice more. "They've taken the bait," she whispered. She and Cassian climbed the bluff under cover of mist, taking the narrow switchback path that led to the cliffs above the old quarry cove. The path was dangerous, slick with moss and sea spray, but Naomi did not hesitate. Her steps were precise, her breath steady. At the top, they crouched behind a low stone wall. Below, the cove stretched out like a trap. Lanterns swayed in the hands of smugglers disembarking to retrieve the barrels. The tide licked hungrily at the shore, rising just fast enough to make haste dangerous. Cassian lifted a spyglass. 3 boats, he murmured. 6 men, all armed. "And none of them know," Naomi said, "that the warehouseman we dismissed 2 days ago left a mark on every cart, nor that the fishing boat hidden behind the eastern jetty carries 2 of your guards." Cassian lowered the spyglass. "You drew them here. Now we close the gate." A single flare shot into the sky, bright as fire against the mist. In seconds, Redcliffe guards emerged from behind rocks and thickets, surrounding the cove with precision. The smugglers shouted, drew weapons, but there was nowhere to run. The boats were blocked. The tide rose quickly now, swallowing their escape with each passing minute. Naomi rose slowly from her crouch. Her eyes followed the scene below, as the guards seized the cargo, lifted her branded barrels, and unrolled forged documents tucked into the lining of the crates, ledgers bearing the seal of Penryn. There, in ink and timber, lay the truth. The following day, the Countess did not appear at the harbour, nor at the magistrate's office, nor at chapel. She remained within the walls of her estate, curtains drawn, her silence heavier than denial. But the summons from London came before nightfall. A letter, written in cold official script, delivered by a courier bearing the royal emblem. She was not arrested, not disgraced, not paraded through the streets. She was removed, quietly, efficiently, her harbour permissions revoked, her coastal charter suspended, her name struck from the Redcliffe supply chain. Naomi stood at the head of the cliff road the morning the Countess's carriage departed. The horses moved slowly, as if they too knew the road would never carry her back. She wore no jewels that day, no crimson silk, only dark wool, tightly bound gloves, and a veil that failed to mask the tightness in her jaw. As the carriage passed Naomi, the Countess did not look at her. But Naomi bowed her head, not in deference, but in farewell. There was no triumph in her posture, only peace. When the carriage disappeared into the horizon, swallowed by mist and road and time, Naomi turned back toward the harbour. She walked slowly, her hands behind her back, her breath matching the rhythm of the sea. Workers lifted their heads as she passed. Some bowed, others simply nodded, eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She said nothing. She had no need to. In the stables below the Redcliffe house, Tommy Reed scribbled a note in his copybook, unaware that she was watching from the ridge. His letters were crooked, but determined. On the final line, he had written a single word: light. Naomi smiled faintly. The bluff no longer held lanterns for smuggling. Now it held beacons. The tide had begun its retreat, leaving long ribbons of silver on the sand below the headland. Naomi stood just above the harbour path, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, though the chill of late afternoon had nothing to do with the salt wind biting at her skin. Behind her, the warm light of Redcliffe flickered from the high windows. Before her, the sea rolled and rolled, a steady breath against the spine of the coast, vast, indifferent, and eternal. She heard his steps before she turned. Cassian did not speak right away. He came to stand beside her, a respectful distance between them. He too was wrapped in the coat he wore when the storms came in, his dark hair tousled by the brine-wet wind. His eyes, shadowed in the falling light, searched the same horizon she did, as though it might offer permission for what he meant to say. "I've never liked winter," he murmured, "but here, it doesn't seem so cold." Naomi looked over at him then, and the corners of her mouth lifted, though she said nothing. The salt stung her lips, but she welcomed the sensation. It reminded her she was alive. Cassian exhaled through his nose, steady and controlled. Then slowly, with care that bordered on reverence, he removed his right glove. His hand, though weathered and scarred along the knuckles, was steady. He extended it between them, palm up. "This isn't a pledge," he said softly, "nor a bargain. I don't offer what you've already built for yourself. I only ask if you'd let me walk beside it." Naomi's gaze fell to his bare hand, not in hesitation, but in contemplation. How many hands had grabbed, demanded, commanded her? And here was his, offered not as a claim, but as a place, a presence. She raised her own, and instead of taking it, reached for his temple. Her fingertips brushed the pale scar that curved just past his hairline, the one she had once touched in uncertain quiet. This time there was no pause, no apology, just Contact. He didn't flinch. Your pain made you careful, she whispered. Mine made me hard, but neither made us cruel. Cassian closed his eyes, only for a moment, as if the truth of it required his full attention, and when he opened them again, they were softer, not unguarded. No, that was not in his nature, but present and warm. The sun fell lower, brushing the sea with gold. Naomi stepped to the edge of the stone wall and sat, her skirts catching the breeze like sails anchored to earth. Cassian followed without a word, lowering himself beside her. They did not touch. They did not need to. The silence between them was neither awkward nor strained. It was full of memories unspoken, wounds endured, and a future not yet shaped but felt nonetheless. The kind of silence that only two people who had earned each other's quiet could share. From the village below, the faint clamor of ships being secured echoed upward. The scent of oil lamps, fish, and distant hearth smoke curled through the wind. Naomi drew in a breath, tasted it, and let it out slowly. I was not supposed to be here, she said, her voice low. Not alive, not free, not seen. You were seen, Cassian replied gently, but by cowards who feared you'd rise. She looked over at him, her eyes shimmering, not with tears, but something deeper, recognition. And you? I feared I'd grow stone around what was left of me, he said. But then someone struck salt into the cracks. That made her smile. She looked back to the sea, shoulders easing slightly. The others still call you the ghost of Redcliffe, you know. He huffed a breath that might have been a laugh. It keeps the lazy sharp. They sat there until the sky darkened to violet and the moon's first glimmer stitched silver onto the waves. When Naomi rose, her hands trailing against the cold stone, Cassian did too. She turned to face him fully, her shawl fluttering against her back. You've not asked what I'll become now, she said, nor what I want. I would never presume to decide for you. I know. That's why I can speak it. She paused, the wind teasing her hair into motion. I want quiet, a hearth that isn't threatened, a table I choose who sits at, and laughter, not loud, but real. Cassian nodded, solemn. You already have the strength to build it. I only hope I might be allowed near its warmth. There was a long pause. Naomi searched his face, the hard angles, the wind-creased lines, and the enduring patience in his expression. Then she reached for his bare hand, not to hold it in full, but to place her fingers lightly in his palm, just enough. He closed them gently around hers. Would you stay for supper? She asked, her voice barely above the wind. He smiled, the first genuine softness she had seen from him. If I'm welcome. You are. Naomi turned and walked back toward the house on the headland, her figure graceful and grounded. Cassian followed, not as shadow, not as savior, but as a man finally ready to begin again, beside a woman who had never stopped fighting to become whole. Inside, the windows of Redcliffe glowed amber, and the sea kept watch. No promises were spoken, no vows exchanged. And yet something immense had shifted, as if the coast itself had exhaled, knowing that this time the salt would preserve, not wound. The scent of salt no longer meant labor, it meant permanence. It clung to the lintels of Naomi's home now, like a reminder, not of wounds endured, but of battles survived and turned into strength. The sun had risen high above the Devon cliffs, casting long, warm fingers across the rooftops of Redcliffe. It was midsummer's day, and the harbour village pulsed with quiet celebration. Children ran barefoot through the grass with ribbons tied to their wrists. Laughter bloomed like wildflowers between stalls of baked apples, salted fish, linen bundles, and hand-dyed wool. The air was thick with honeysuckle and wood smoke, and above it all, the gulls cried their eternal songs. Naomi Trenwith stood near the edge of the square, watching it unfold. The breeze lifted the hem of her pale slate-blue gown, not the coarse wool of saltworks labour, but soft linen, simple in cut, tied at the waist with a sash of woven indigo. Around her neck hung a chain of hammered copper, the same shade as the streaks in her hair now, touched gently by sun and time. She was not hidden anymore. She walked upright, greeted by name, and no one turned away or whispered. There were no titles to anchor her, but she needed none. Naomi had become something more enduring than status, a woman whose story could no longer be sold. Beside her stood Tommy, taller now, though still limping, his gait slow but steady. His brown curls had grown unruly, falling into his eyes as he read aloud from a worn book to a cluster of younger children seated on the steps of the salt shed. They leaned against each other, lulled by his voice, every syllable drawn from hard-won letters Naomi had taught him to shape. The apprentices, 4 of them, ranging in age from 11 to 16, had already packed the day's salt stores beneath canvas tarps. Their uniforms bore Naomi's seal, a twin wave curved into the base of a triangle, the hidden brand she once burned into the underside of barrels in secret. Now it was carved into stone, above the entryway to the works. Beyond the square, Cassian Blackmore approached on horseback, not cloaked in ducal pomp, but dressed in loose cream sleeves rolled at the forearms, brown riding breeches, and boots softened by frequent wear. The silver at his temples had deepened, lending his features a stately resolve rather than sorrow. His coat was unbuttoned, his pace unhurried. As he reached Naomi, he dismounted without a word, offering her a nod that held more affection than any declaration could. She didn't speak either. She only offered her arm, and he placed his hand lightly atop it. They walked slowly past stalls, their movements in rhythm. Not choreographed, not performed, shared. Around them the fair went on, fiddles tuning, dough sizzling in pans, the wheelwright's children arguing over painted toys. Yet it was as if a quiet hush moved with them, like the tide drawing breath beneath a full moon. An older woman, Agnes Brewer, once displaced from her cottage, waved from behind a table of wool shawls. Naomi waved back. It had been Agnes who helped found the Widow's Fund, the one Naomi had seeded with the first of her legal wages as master of stores. Now, 6 women kept trade sheds of their own, a weaver, a baker, a spinner, a midwife, a herbalist. They stood in quiet solidarity at opposite ends of the fair, nodding as Naomi passed. No one knelt, but many smiled. When the dance circle formed at twilight, Cassian turned to her. "Would you?" She looked at him, not for permission, for confirmation, and in his gaze she found nothing but steady offering. So she stepped forward, and he followed. The music rose, flute and drum, fiddle and clap, and Naomi and Cassian moved not with the skill of practiced dancers, but with the certainty of people who had long since stopped performing. Each step was earned, each glance honest. There was no spectacle to it, and that was its power. After the final note faded and the dancers scattered for cider and bread, Naomi and Cassian slipped away, walking the narrow path that wound back toward the cliffs. The sky had turned to copper, the sea below burning gold with the last light of day. Inside Naomi's cottage, a stone structure built where the old overseer's house had once loomed, the fire had already been lit. The hearth glowed with soft warmth, casting shadows that swayed gently against the walls, lined with drying herbs and small ledgers of inventory. On the mantel rested the carved box. Naomi paused when she saw it, her breath catching faintly. Cassian stood behind her, quiet. She stepped forward, fingers brushing the top of the lid. It was made of polished walnut, the edges smoothed by hand, the inlay a swirl of tiny salt crystals embedded like stars into the grain. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on deep blue velvet, lay a ring. It was silver, simple but etched with precision, bearing the same hidden brand she had once pressed beneath barrels and now worn proudly on her apron seal. She held it delicately, letting it catch the firelight. "This isn't a symbol of possession," Cassian said behind her, voice low and sure, "only of remembrance that the sharpest salt didn't burn us away. It preserved." Naomi turned to him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then slowly she slipped the ring onto her finger. She did not cry. She did not speak. She only stepped closer until her hand brushed the side of his coat, and his fingers found hers once more. Not as binding, not as chain, but as bond freely chosen. They stood before the fire, its light flickering across the room like the wind across the water. No vows were uttered, no priest called, but something ancient passed between them, older than church or ink, something forged not in ceremony, but in endurance and salt and love. Outside, the sea whispered against the rocks, and the wind carried their silence to the waves. The wind had not changed. It still carried the scent of salt and heather through the crevices of the Redcliffe cliffs, still whistled through the grasses that crowned the headland, but the village below had grown, not wider, but fuller, firmer, like a once battered ship now steady under the hands of a crew that had learned to read the tides. Naomi Blackmore stood at the edge of her garden, fingers buried in the dark soil where thyme and rosemary grew in rows. Her apron was stained with earth, and her knees ached faintly from crouching, but she welcomed the ache. It was the kind that reminded you that the ground still trusted your steps. Behind her, the saltworks chimneys puffed pale smoke into the sky, not from overwork or reckless output, but from balanced labor, fairer pay, and hands that knew they were more than replaceable. The old overseer's house had been turned into a schoolhouse. Naomi's own home now opened its doors twice a week to women who needed counsel, not charity, just clarity. Tommy had grown tall, 17 now, and with a voice so deep it startled those who hadn't seen him since the tribunal. He supervised the ledger apprentices, walked with less of a limp, and had begun writing his own small treatise on tidal calculations. He still read aloud at dusk, not just to orphans anymore, but to villagers who brought their mending and their long days, and let his words carry them to other shores. The Countess of Penryn had not returned. After her quiet summons to London, her holdings were stripped, and her name lost favour at court. It was said she tried to mount a social return, but women who dealt in other women's suffering do not often find easy forgiveness. Her name lingered in coastal legend like a cautionary tale, not of cruelty alone, but of arrogance that assumed the tide would never turn. Cassian Blackmore remained the Duke of Redcliffe in name, but in practice he had become something else, something gentler. He no longer held court in the formal parlour, but in the small room by the kitchen, where a cask of salt and a stack of sea charts always waited. His scar had faded into his skin, a silver ridge that Naomi traced sometimes when they sat together, her head resting on his shoulder as he read aloud the day's reports. They had not married in the church. They had not worn rings in public. But every villager knew, and every child learned, not all love needs brass bells and candles to be real. Some loves are made of quieter metals, forged in brine, burnished by patience. At the midsummer fair that year, the crowd gathered earlier than usual. There were more tents now, more tables, more laughter. Naomi wore a soft cotton gown with sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hands still bore calluses, though her work was different now. Less casks, more decisions. Cassian arrived just before the lanterns were lit. He brought with him a new chart of the northern shipping lanes and a small girl who clung to his hand. A sailor's orphan named May, recently adopted into one of the trade families. She ran ahead to join the other children. He stayed back, watching Naomi across the square, his eyes crinkling in that same way they had the first time he saw her command a salt pan with only her voice. They did not rush to embrace. They did not kiss. But when she turned, her smile found him before her feet did. They danced, not because it was tradition, but because it had become a promise. One they kept each year, in front of everyone, so all could see what endurance looked like when it softened. As the fire crackled and music rose, Naomi glanced across the square. She saw Agnes Brewer still weaving, Tommy laughing beside a girl with ink on her fingers, and a widow from Cornwall receiving coins for her first basket of smoked fish. And Naomi knew. The love she had chosen had not wilted. It had grown, not just between her and Cassian, but outward, into the bones of the village, into policy, into practice, into lives changed, because one woman had dared to refuse silence. The stars emerged slowly over the sea. The wind shifted, and in its song one might have heard it, the whisper of a love that had taken root in salt and fire and bloomed despite every storm. Some stories are not born from fireworks or declarations shouted across ballrooms. Some are forged in silence, in salt, in the steady persistence of a woman who refuses to be erased. Naomi's journey reminds us that dignity is not something others grant us. It is something we choose to carry, even when the world tries to strip it away. Her story is for every soul who has been told they are too late, too broken, or no longer useful. For every heart that has been overlooked, underestimated, or sold short. May Naomi show you that it is never too late to reclaim your place, your voice, and your worth. Cassian's quiet loyalty teaches us that real love doesn't arrive to rescue, it arrives to recognize. And when it does, it doesn't need vows or jewels to take root. It simply stays. If this story moved you, if it left you thinking or feeling something deeper, we'd love to know. Tell us in the comments what this journey meant to you. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word harvest below. That one word will let us know who stayed with Naomi until the very last tide. If you'd like to help us keep bringing these deeply emotional period stories to life, consider sending a super thanks here on YouTube with any amount you feel inspired to give. It keeps the lights on and the ink flowing. And if that's not possible right now, know that just sharing this video with a friend, a family member, or someone who needs a reminder of their strength is already a gift. More stories like this one await you. Just look at the cards we've left on screen. Let yourself be swept away once more. Thank you for being here. You are part of this story now.